Well, good evening, everyone. It's good to see you. My name is Joel Lohr. I am president here at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to the Rion Lecture and to our speaker tonight. The Rion Lecture, if you don't know much about it, I'd love to share a little bit about it because it's an important part of our lectureships here. It was established as an endowed lectureship to honor former Hartford, then Hartford Seminary president, Dr. Michael Rion, who unfortunately is unwell tonight, and he was just feeling bad about that. We thought Nancy might be here, his wife, to say hello, but I don't see her yet. Maybe she'll trickle in here. But Dr. Rion was deeply committed. If you knew him as president, he was deeply committed to lay ministry, to strengthening the connection between religious faith and one's involvement in professional life, to professional work and community service. He was also the first then seminary president to not be ordained, and at that time that was really significant. And so they wanted to honor that by establishing this lecture in his honor. It is a biennial lecture. It happens every 2 years, and it's we ask a layperson to address our community, and we ask someone who embodies a commitment to ministry in their daily life in a distinctive way. The goals of the lectureship are 3: to honor Michael Rion, who we know, to honor an individual who has made a significant contribution to society on a national or international level, and to provide a learning experience for our community about the various forms of ministry in daily life. So I want to welcome you all. I also want to welcome those on the live stream today. We have almost 100 people signed up, I think mainly for the live stream, I guess, but some of you are here. But we're delighted that you are joining us. I should say the millions of people tuning in online to hear this tonight. Let me introduce our speaker, who I consider a friend, and I really think it's an honor that we have him here tonight. The president and CEO of the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving since 2017, Jay Williams leads the foundation's commitment to dismantle structural racism, achieve equity, and improve social and economic mobility in our region in partnership with nonprofit organizations and community stakeholders. Jay serves on many local boards at the national level. He is a member of the Community Foundation Opportunity Network, chair of the Council on Foundations, and board vice chair of the Center for Community Progress. Some of you serve on boards. I think you know what a commitment that is. So we just want to acknowledge that service that you give, Jay. Prior to coming to the foundation, this is outstanding stuff too, by the way. Prior to coming to the foundation, Jay served as a U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development, where he led the federal economic development agenda for the United States. He also served as Deputy Director of the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs at the White House, where he was the principal liaison between the President of the United States and local elected officials. Boy, we need you, Jay. Before joining the Obama administration, Jay served as mayor of Youngstown, Ohio. Mayor of Youngstown, Ohio. His election as the first Black and youngest mayor in the city's history was a pivotal point in his personal, professional, and spiritual life. For Jay, it remains a reflective moment of the intersection and alignment of one's career and calling. And I will say that I have sat with Jay at a couple of lunches, and it is hard to have a conversation with Jay without it going deep. He is a person of character, a person who I enjoy talking to, and I think we're going to learn a lot about calling tonight. Let me add that his title tonight is in fact called It's a Calling, and Jay insisted, I think this is the first time for a Rion lecture, he said, I will do this as long as it's not all lecture. I want it to be participatory. And so we are going to not only hear a few words from Jay first, but we're going to have an engagement with Jay, and he is going to, I think you're going to moderate your own Q&A, right? Yeah, this is going to be a discussion and a dialogue, so I'm looking forward to this. Can you please join me in welcoming Jay Williams?
Joel, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here this evening. So a couple of things. First of all, Joel's voice is so soothing, and the baritone, and my voice is not soothing, and doesn't have a lot of baritone. So it's funny, just following after Joel, he said such a wonderful tenor for us this evening. And I appreciate what he said, because as I was invited to be here, I was honored and I was intrigued when he described the Rion Lecture. And I have to give a special shout out to Susan, who the flexibility she demonstrated, because I consider myself less a lecturer. Now, this might be news to my son, that I consider myself less a lecturer, because he would roll his eyes at 14 years old and say, Dad, yeah, no, plenty of lectures. And more of a conversationalist. I enjoy conversations to the extent where my wife and I will be somewhere and I'll be engaged in a conversation with someone and she'll be ready to go, or she'll sort of, after the conversation, ask me who that was. And very frequently I will say, I have no idea. We just struck up a conversation based on some random issue or something that we've found in common, because I just really enjoy having conversations more than anything else. And I've appreciated what was a somewhat challenging issue for my parents when I was younger. You know, the parent-teacher conferences would say, Jay's a good student, you know, but he's a chatterbox. He talks, and that has now manifested itself in my wife and our son. But now, some 30, 40 years later, it has proven to be an asset. So I enjoy the opportunity to really engage. So tonight, as was talked about, I appreciate the notion of this setting that we're in, the Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, and this notion of having the focus on religion, but also as a layperson, how it's an opportunity to share how my faith has, throughout my life, intersected with my career in ways that, looking back now at 53 years old, I can appreciate and see clearly, but I didn't always see clearly during the pathway that it was occurring. So to set the premise, I thought I'd start with sort of 4 sections. You know, the people, the place, the premise, and then the pathway. Starting with the people who have early on in my life influenced me the most. And for me, it's easy. It was first and foremost my parents. There were lots of people who had influence and impact on my life and continue to do so, but no individuals on the face of the planet have had more influence on me and my life, my career, my thinking than my parents. Again, far from perfect, because none of us are. Loving parents, you know, we had our differences of opinions, as all parents and children do, but they have had a profound impact on my life. And then second to my parents was a charismatic Pentecostal preacher who was my pastor for 30 some odd years until he passed away back in 2010. And his name was Bishop Norman L. Wagner. And while he was charismatic and well-versed and a wise man, I think what fascinated me about him was his uncanny ability to find light in the darkest of places. You know, he, in my mind, at some point as a young person, I would have swore he had X-ray vision, because he could just see through a circumstance or situation and find a pathway that would, at the other side of that, lead to something more positive, something, and it was more than just an optimism. I think I'm generally an optimistic person, but he could truly find light in the darkest of situations. As a matter of fact, one of the enduring lessons that he taught was the fact that differentiating and understanding the importance of how you view something versus having a vision of something. And the most simplistic definition, you know, a view is what you see. You are viewing me as I stand here tonight. I am viewing you. We view circumstances and situations in our daily living. And that's important, but Bishop Wagner also then talked about having a vision. And a vision, as he was describing it in the context, was something that is inspiring and aspirational. So it isn't the same as a view. Me looking at you today or you looking at me today in a view, but if we're talking about a vision of something, it is an inspiring and aspirational place that might not be tangible, that might not be what the circumstances or situations are in the moment, but certainly something that has a profound impact. So those were the people. In shaping my journey, there was or is the place. And it was a place that Joel referred to, Youngstown, Ohio, my hometown where I was born and reared. And without getting into too much detail, to describe Youngstown, Ohio, lots of similarities to Hartford, but it's a city that at one point in its history had the economic vibrance, the political relevance, arts and cultural. You could not have a conversation about politics or art or culture and not in some way have some conversation about Youngstown, Ohio, a city in Northeast Ohio that was never the biggest city, but that is a city that had so much relevance at its peak. It was a steel town, manufacturing. There were lots of very notable people who were born in Youngstown, who did business in Youngstown. So it was a place that was growing very rapidly, and at one point had one of the fastest growing home ownership rates. Again, was an economic and cultural and political powerhouse. And at the same time, it was a city that, when it started its decline, suffered one of the most ignominious declines that you can imagine. And for a long period of time was seen as the poster child for the collapse of the industrial economy of this country, a city that was plagued with all the social ills that you could imagine, the crime, a city that was known for political corruption and organized crime and all the things that went along with that. So this was the place that I was born, and this was the place where, during my most formidable years, my view of life and living was shaped. So the people, the place, and then the premise. So the premise of how early on my career and my calling and my spiritual view of things intersected was, again, going back to Bishop Wagner. Probably, early in my career, he preached a message, and it was called Sacred Calls to Secular Places. And immediately what struck me was the contradiction between those two terms, right? When you think of sacred, you think of things that are holy. You think of things that are associated with religion oftentimes. You think of things that are set apart for specific use. But then when you hear the term secular, it is typically seen as the opposite, right? Things of the world, things that are not in any way, shape, or form attached to or associated with spirituality or religion. So just that message that he preached, Sacred Calls to Secular Places, little did I know that would sort of set me on a path that I would later come to see how those two things intersected, how, the faith that I held, and I never felt the need to hide my faith, but nor was I one to broadcast it. I didn't use it as a battering ram and sort of say, look at me, and my faith is what drives so many of my decisions or the pathway that I've get in my career. So we've got the people, we've got the place, Youngstown, Ohio, the premise early on when I heard this message, Sacred Calls to Secular Places, and then the pathway, where I started my professional career. And again, try as I might, the message when I was growing up in Youngstown for my generation was like, the best days of this community are behind us. Parents, family members, if you loved your child or your niece or your nephew, you would tell them, you know what, get as much education as you can and get a one-way ticket, because this place is forlorn, it is written off, its best days are behind it, there is nothing left here, and if you can escape, you should escape. And when you hear that message, and when you look around and see the conditions, when you see the homicide rate, when you see the failing economy, when you see the unemployment, when you see the social strife, it makes sense, right? You're in the stage of your career where you're graduating and you're getting ready to go to school, and you think, boy, this just isn't a place where I can envision any type of quality of life and living. And that's where, as much as I loved my town, I was young and was like, yeah, no, I got to go to the big city. I want to get my education and go make my way in the world. And as try as I might, I found Youngstown ultimately was the place that kept me anchored. And I don't mean shackled in a sense of like misery, but as much as I was eager and ready to find my way somewhere else, it was a place that I continued to be connected to and grounded in. And at the same time, while you think of an anchor, it ultimately became the place that was my launching pad. So, a city, I often described it, as we hear the novel, A Tale of Two Cities. You saw both sides, or I felt both sides of that city, keeping me grounded and not letting me go, but at the same time, ultimately serving as a launching pad. And it was because, back to the view and the vision that Bishop Wagner talked about, the things that I saw in that city were truly things that would make you want to leave. It were things that would make you understand how people suffered, how a city that once had a great reputation was now, had a reputation that just preceded it, that was just not anything that was of significant appeal. Not to say that the people weren't, or there weren't good things happening, but the overall reputation. So that was the view of the city that I had, and that many people had. But when you talk about a vision, the vision that someone like Dr. Wagner continued to teach and preach about was a much different city. And if you didn't know he was talking about Youngstown, Ohio, you would think, boy, this is a place of prosperity. This is a place of opportunity. This is a place that is going to be a place that attracts people from across the globe. But again, he's talking about the same city, Youngstown, Ohio. So I started my journey with all of this, and not because I planned exactly where I was going to go. I went to school, and initially I had aspiration of being an aerospace engineer. I loved engineering and tinkering, and that's where I set my sights. Notwithstanding a couple of bouts with calculus and differential equations, I started really thinking, boy, is this what I want to do? But I started my career, and ultimately, what I thought was as just trying to work and make a little bit of money in college, ended up in the financial industry, ended up working at a local bank. And this was a time where this bank was undergoing a significant amount of criticism for not serving the community, the neighborhoods in which I grew up in. And I didn't know it at the time, but after getting into the bank and getting into the management training, they came to me and said, hey, we are starting a program that is going to help individuals who otherwise maybe would have never had an opportunity to purchase a home. So, and we want you to be, the loan officer for the city of Youngstown. So, in some regards, had I been a little bit older, I might have looked upon that cynically, but early in my career, I'm like, yeah, I'll be your guy. And one thing led to another, and in a period of, 2 or 3 years, what I saw was a bank that, because of, again, maybe their intent wasn't ideal. They weren't doing it because it was the right thing to do. They were doing it because of the criticism they were receiving. But the ultimate result ended up with hundreds and hundreds of people who would have never set foot into a financial institution ultimately becoming homeowners. And we know in this country, the most common path to building wealth for your family is through home ownership. And it became to the point where I was, again, a loan officer, so I wasn't writing the loans. I was simply putting the information together and trying to make a case for people being able to be homeowners in a city that was in dire need of that. And what it showed me is that in that moment, while I was thinking that, boy, I might want a career in banking, that the practices that the bank had previously engaged in were, willing to, at least in that moment, change those practices. And it taught me, again, from a very dark place where I ultimately had people years later coming up to me with tears in their eyes telling me how, you were my loan officer. Now, again, I wasn't approving. I was simply getting the information. But I was skipped for it. Even after I become mayor, people like, no, I remember you as a loan officer at, 22 years old who helped my family and I purchase our first home. So that became a very successful program. But what I realized after the fact is once the criticism and the spotlight turned away from the bank, it was easy for them to walk away from those practices. So to me, it was frustrating because I wanted to think that, again, here is an institution that is helping people to, access wealth and to build home ownership and to move forward in their life and living. But once the spotlight goes away and the criticism dies down, those practices reverted back to what they had been. So I found that to be frustrating. So I moved up and went to a different bank and got some more education, got some more skills, and ultimately landed at a bank that allowed me not just to engage in the practices, but ultimately find myself in a position to help influence and change policies. And in that regard, while the practices resulted in many individuals being able to access homeownership and wealth, those practices were more easily changed. And I found in the next phase of my career, being able to take a situation that was, again, less than ideal, but dive deeper into changing practices that ultimately help more people across a broader array of geography, have a relationship that would allow them to provide for not just provide for the families, they were doing that, but to build the wealth and ultimately find themselves in a better life and living. And it was a early indication to me that it wasn't my intent to necessarily be a change agent. But when I told you early, the thing that impacted me about Bishop Wagner was being able to see a dark situation and ultimately find and help lead to a more prosperous and positive outcome became a characteristic of my career, and something that, again, was really defined and driven by my faith. So I did that, but ultimately where it came into sharper focus, which is what was alluded to, that ultimately led me running for mayor, was I left the bank and went to work for the city. And this city, as I was described to you, was a city that really reflected the scripture in Proverbs that says, where there is no vision, the people perish. And it was interesting because I would often quote that in my position, not as mayor. I was director of one of the city agencies. And people would say, well, I am in no way, shape, or form found myself wanting to be drawn to the ministry as in terms of the spiritual side of that, or being in ministry, but understood that this was a city that for decades had suffered without a vision, that was caught and defined by its failures. And when I say the failure that people really in that region got caught on, was they will tell you where they were, what they were doing on September 19th, 1977, when one of the largest steel mills in the region announced its closure. So, 10,000 jobs lost within, a couple of months, 50,000 jobs lost, a collapse of an economy, a collapse of an identity. And this was some 40 years later, people were still lamenting and stuck on that view of Youngstown. They had no vision of what the city could be. They were stuck on the view of what happened. And it was reinforced and affirmed because every story you heard about the decline of manufacturing and the social ills and the urban decay, Youngstown was mentioned in some way, shape, or form. So what they were hearing from others was only reinforcing what they were seeing in their day-to-day life. It was not allowing them to have a vision of not what was happening today, but instead about what Youngstown could be. So when I went to work for the city, I was, I didn't go to the city to say, okay, well, this is my call or my role to lead this. But again, as happens in a calling, you don't always write your own ticket, right? If it's a calling, it means it was already predestined or preordained. That pathway was laid out. Our job is just to submit to our faith and our belief and to follow it and to say, look, I want to be in a place where I can be most beneficial as it relates to my faith. I wasn't one to say, well, this is what I think I am specifically supposed to do, but instead wanting to yield myself to my faith. And where that led was the mayor at the time who hired me said, Jay, we're going to engage in a process where and very frankly, probably early on, there was a lot of cynicism that we're going to engage in a planning initiative to sort of figure out how we can collectively, as city leaders and community participants, find a different narrative for this city. And what started as a process, and I'm not a planner, of engaging people about the things that they were seeing versus the things that could be, ended up with us talking to more than 1,500 people across the city and across the region. And what happened is that communities like people need to grieve, they need to mourn. It was never acknowledged that there was a period of time where the people who were in this community, could be able to grieve what was lost and what they called the glory days, but they were never then brought together to say, okay, let's acknowledge that, but let's talk about not what we're looking at today, but truly a vision of a Youngstown that's a different city, a vision of Youngstown that's a different community, a vision of a Youngstown that builds on the assets that we have, a vision of Youngstown that is more equitable, more accessible. And in doing that, over the course of about 18 months, there emerged a new vision of the city. And the vision at that point, this was in the early 2000s, the late 90s, early 2000s, that became colloquially known as Youngstown 2010. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people started to see a different view of the circumstances that they were facing. They started to see the city in a different light. And again, when you said where there is no vision, we have seen what happens when there isn't a vision of a city. We have seen the Exodus. We have seen all the things that plague and continue to keep us in strife and misery. But when a different vision of the city emerged, people started to get excited. People started to come together. People who would otherwise have said, you know what, we're done. I've written this place off, said, wait a minute, I now think that there is a pathway from the darkest depths of what this city has been experiencing for the last 30 or 40 years to something that excites me, something that we can aspire to. So we went through that process, and again, this notion of how you connect one's spirituality, it was what I had seen and learned and been taught, in my faith and in my beliefs, actually coming to pass. Now, again, I'm working in a city. If you want to have a platform for your faith and your religious beliefs, working in a city isn't the place to do that, right? Going into public service isn't necessarily the place to do that. But at the same time, it was undeniable to me to see how those scriptural principles, those things that I held to be true, were actually manifesting themselves in the most secular of places. So that led to a pivotal point in my professional and personal and spiritual career, because the mayor that had hired me was term limited. There was a mayoral race that was on the horizon. And I felt that our goal was to take this new vision that hundreds of people had put their time, energy, and effort in, and to take it to the individuals who had declared themselves as candidates and said, listen, the community has put a year and a half of time and energy and effort into a vision. This vision should be the platform and the discussion and the debate of this next mayoral race. Because again, if you're running and you want to serve people, you should have some connection to what people think is the vision for their community. So we were all excited. The group of us who had worked on this were all excited. And in typical Youngstown fashion, the response was like, yeah, no, that's not how things work here. So, in the city that I loved, basically, it was name recognition. You raise a lot of money, backdoor political room deals, and in so many times, that's how the mayoralty was decided. There was no notion of what was actually, unfortunately, best for the people. It was like, well, how can I raise my profile as an individual? How can I use my political connections to win this mayoral election? And there was a small group who felt that this would probably be the last opportunity to galvanize people around a vision, to have them actually believe that there is a better tomorrow. So, when that was the response, there was a small group that said, you know what, somebody's got to run. Someone's got to step up. And if not for the purpose of winning the mayoral election, at least forcing the conversation to be about what people just spent a year and a half putting together. And somehow, in that conversation, people started looking at me. And I, had no aspirations to run for mayor. I felt my call was to help put this plan together, serve it to those who had declared themselves the political candidates, and then move from there. And when that didn't happen, and through conversations of prayer, I felt that yes, perhaps running for mayor for the purpose of a conversation and forcing the vision to be at the center of this mayoral race was something that I could do. My wife and I, wise counsel prayed. It wasn't a dream in the night. I didn't have a vision that all of a sudden this is what you're supposed to do. There was no lightning, there was no thunder. But what's interesting to me is when I did make the decision, my wife and I made a decision, and we shared it with our pastor, Bishop Wagner, the man who had been preaching and teaching and putting this vision into us, there was hesitation. And it was interesting because as much as he believed what he was preaching and teaching, there was a paternal protection of, wait a minute, I understand what happens in political campaigns. He understands what happens in a city like Youngstown. He said, yes, we've been teaching this, but now that you're putting it into action, I'm a little bit concerned. Is there a naivety here? Do you understand what you're getting into? And we said, listen, if we're ever going to put our faith into action, the Bible talks, faith without works is dead. What good is it for us to be taught and preached and to learn these things and to study these principles if we are unwilling to put them into action? And understanding that doesn't mean that everything is going to, magically work out. We still have to do the work, right? I still would have to put together a campaign. I would still have to, in fact, I had to quit my job because there was laws that prevented me from doing what I was doing and ultimately engaging. But I felt in that moment that call was what I was supposed to do. It was my wife and I. Now, again, we had to be wise. We still had to make our mortgage payment. We still had to cover the things that we had to do. But to quit and to ultimately declare a candidacy for mayor, not as a part of the two major political parties, because, at that point, the parties were corrupt and they were broken. And when I did inquire, they said, you know what? We don't know who you are. You haven't paid your dues. You're 32 years old. And if you haven't noticed, Youngstown doesn't elect black folks to citywide office. The city had never elected. So to me, that was like, okay, hear you loud and clear. Declared, ran as an independent candidate with all the detractors, with all the critics, with all the cynics who said, this isn't going to happen. You're wasting your time. A little bit later on in the race, as it became a race of, 6 people. I was one of 6 individuals in that race. I'll fast forward because that gave me a view of my city that I had not seen. This was a city I spent my almost entire life in. And when you walk the streets of your city, you have a different perspective, both good, bad, and everything in between. I found myself walking in parts of the city where I grew up. I was very comfortable. I'm from the hood. But I remember going and campaigning in parts of the city that were sort of the fancy parts of the city that I'd driven through, or as a kid you sort of see, but you're not welcome there. But I said that if I was going to declare as a candidate for mayor, knowing what the history of the city was, I wasn't going to give individuals an opportunity to say, well, he never came and asked. So we did come and ask. And some people were unequivocally clear about, you have no business here, and we don't want you here, move on. But at the end of the day, I told my wife when the last day of the campaign and the polls had closed, that I knew this is what I didn't know if I was going to win, but I knew that this was a journey that we were called to embark upon, because it allowed us to exercise our faith of what we had been taught, to put that into action. It gave me a view and an appreciation that come win or lose, I felt that I was going to be a better individual, professionally, personally. It allowed me to have a better understanding of where my call was going. Long story short, the night, as they were counting, the political pundits said, listen, this kid, he's a good kid, but he wasted his time because he went to parts of the city that have historically never supported an African-American candidate. He didn't go and build his base. He just isn't going to be a person that this city is going to elect as mayor. And he's a political neophyte. He's an unknown quantity. And well, you know how this ended, right? So the next morning, the city paper has a big headline that says "City picks Jay," and I wake up as mayor of this city that, again, for all intents and purposes, was the equivalent of Nazareth in the Bible, right? When people say, "Can anything good come out of this city?" That was what people thought of Youngstown. Thank you. And it was, again, not because I was the, favored candidate. It wasn't because I was the most politically astute, but again, it was that notion of understanding the view of what you see versus the vision of what a city and a community could be. So I'll end by saying that ultimately, that experience took me places that I certainly didn't see myself as qualified to go. And one of the things I took away is that your calling will take you beyond where your credentials will. And when I say that, it's because I've got a bachelor's degree from Youngstown State University, right? Youngstown State is not an Ivy League school. I started my master's and then ended up in my career. So my credentials on paper, wouldn't have had me going to, MIT and University of Chicago and, Harvard to speak to students about how a city that was written off ultimately was one that was talked about in the national and international press, about a city that had saw such a precipitous decline that was now figuring out and navigating its way. That's my credentials wouldn't have taken me to those places, but your calling will. When I was invited to go to Germany and to be on a tour of European cities that were undergoing the same economic upheaval as Youngstown, Ohio, when I was invited to Detroit to talk about cities that were 5 or 10 times the size of Youngstown, the national press stopped talking about the decline and the failure of a city and started talking about the story of a city that was defining itself not by its failures, but by its new vision. So to me, again, I wasn't the PhD lecturer. I wasn't the person who was the expert in this. It was allowing your calling to take you where your credentials can't and won't. Ultimately, it was how I got to Washington, D.C. I was in my second term as mayor, very much intending to serve, and my secretary calls one day and says, the White House is on the phone. And, like, do you want to call? Take the call. I was like, sure. Long story short, well, again, prior to that, I'm sorry, after all of this, there were some folks who came to visit me prior to the election in 2008 and said, hey, we've seen what's happened here in Youngstown, and we would like for you to share with us sort of what this pathway looked like, both your own election in Youngstown in 2005 and this national turnaround. And they introduced themselves as early members of, then Senator Obama's campaign team. So again, happy to share what was in Youngstown. I didn't know who Senator Obama. I knew of him, but didn't know. And then, long story short, had an opportunity to support and campaign, but had no intention on doing anything other than serving out my term. But so when that call came, they said, what, we would like you to join the administration. And again, it wasn't because of my credentials. It was because they said, we've seen what you've been able to do with others in Youngstown, Ohio. We have a vision of this happening in cities across the country, Gary, Indiana, and Flint, Michigan, and so many other those communities. And would you come and join this administration to help put together a vision of prosperity for these communities that are similarly situated to Youngstown, rural communities that are undergoing economic upheaval. And to me, that ultimately, serving those 6 years was a pathway to me coming here to Hartford, Connecticut, and joining the Hartford Foundation. So I'll conclude by saying, it was such a humbling experience. And while I've enjoyed it from a professional standpoint and have been blessed as a result of that, it was ultimately because the faith that I had, the willingness to acquiesce to a call that wasn't always clear in terms of where it was going to take me, but was clear that it was about leading organizations that were, in dark places to places of greater success, struggling organizations, leading them to success. And not as an individual, no single individual is that bright or that talented, but to be able to galvanize and inspire others to act on my faith in a way that didn't broadcast and say, look at me, I'm so spiritually grounded, so spiritually wise, but instead saying, you know what, I'm willing to, even as a leader, find those who are talented, find those who might not fit in places where others think they should fit in, and put that together to acquiesce and to allow yourself to be led by your calling. So it has been a journey that is, I'm 53, so I still got some years of work ahead of me. Ethan's 14, and we want to make sure we do what we can, my wife and I, to help him, get into college and get through college. But I just appreciate at this point in my life being able to look back and see those things that weren't clearly then, more clearly now, but also know that there's another decade plus ahead of me, that I can take this learning, take this experience, and certainly in the position that I am in now, to work with a group of colleagues around a vision for the city of Hartford and the 28 towns that we serve, that again doesn't have to have me saying, well, you have to have the same faith that I do, or you have to believe, like I do. You may believe, you may not believe. That's all well and good. I know for me how I must continue to understand and appreciate the intersection between, my career and my calling, and how my faith can manifest itself in my work in a way, that doesn't have people think, well, I'm not trying to proselytize and I don't need to try to convert, that it is about how it has allowed me to be in positions that ultimately find, as I was so impacted by Bishop Wagner, those darkest situations, and find some light and some purpose out of that. So thank you. I probably talked way more than I intended to. So in doing this, I'm curious and interested. And when I say I'm a conversationalist of others, their journeys, their observations, their questions, because, we intend to be in this community, my wife and I, and our son and my mom lives with us for many years to come. So, with the familiar faces I see here and the new faces that I'll meet this evening, I hope that this is just the beginning of a relationship that together we, see the current struggles that this community faces, very real, but also collectively, are part of a vision. So in the next several years, we find ourselves in a much more prosperous, equitable, and thriving community. So as a result of that, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak tonight. And again, now questions, comments, please.
Thank you so much for that lovely walk through your journey and your life, Mr. Williams. It's really lovely to have you here. I don't know the Bible that well, but I know that there's a scripture in there in Proverbs that says, your gifts will make room for you. And so it sounds like to me that your minister knew that you would somehow impact the future in a positive way, and that he knew that your gifts would make room for you. So my question is, when did you determine that you were a change agent? Or I guess consciously know that you were a change agent. And then how did you have the courage to stand behind that, to put it in action?
Well, that's a great question. And you mentioned you may not know the Bible well, but clearly you've got wisdom and knowledge. And that is something early on. It's almost as if you were, observing early in my life, because again, grew up, teenager, did all the things teenagers wanted to fit in. Went to a small school. I've always been tall, as I got a little older. So people like sports. So probably the most uncoordinated basketball player that you will ever see. So this notion of growing up tall with these expectations, and my friends who were prolific athletes, and when you're 13, 14, 15, that doesn't feel good. You want to fit in. You want to, be good at sports. You want to do these things. And I remember him vividly telling me, Jay, you're not always going to fit in those places. And he used that scripture, that your gifts will make room for you. He said, Jay, your gifts are different than the gifts of some of your friends. They may be, you've got a personality, you like to engage people, but the things that you aspire to do aren't always going to look like the things that others aspire to do. And I heard it, but at 14, I just wanted to fit in. I just wanted to be with the cool kids. I just wanted so, it took time and other supports, because early on, I didn't have that confidence or courage to sort of stand in that, or to sort of embrace that. Because again, at that age, you just want to be either well-liked or like just neutral and not picked on. You don't want to be different. So, eventually, and this is again through the support of my parents and coaches and so many others, began to say, okay, my destiny in life isn't going to be a star basketball player, isn't going to be a prolific athlete. It came through, and that's why it's so important when we hear, yes, my parents and my pastor, but coaches and others who, helped me gain that confidence, who provided other opportunities for me to see that the gifts that I had would provide opportunities. And as you get a little older and as you get a little more mature and people are patient with you, it ultimately, now I look back, and I'm sure we all do, I look back and some of the things that I was so worried about and so concerned about, I look back now and like, oh my gosh, I spent time or lost sleep over that. And it's also helped me as a parent because with, my son, I know now and I can see some of his pathway, but at 14, he doesn't want to hear that. He just wants to fit in. He just wants to be a good athlete. He just wants to, and I'm like, Ethan, trust me. He's like, yeah, Dad, I don't want to hear this right now. So to your point, it was time, the care and concern of others, other mentors, who said, Jay, it's okay. It will be okay. And as those opportunities to exercise the gifts that I did have, and they began to make room for me, it began to build that confidence. And, that's how it happened. So again, it was not a smooth journey all the time, as life isn't, but that's really where, thank you. It began to resonate. And I'm so appreciative of those who, just stuck with me. Like who said, trust me, I know, Jay, you're gonna keep wanting to do it this way. And at 14, 15, 16, hard-headed kids, we're gonna learn. But ultimately, it started to demonstrate and then gave me the confidence and actually the excitement and ambition to really be comfortable in that.
I have a question for you. I just love your story. Thank you for sharing it. Inspiring. Maybe I see some of my own things in my own life in your life, and I'm just grateful to hear you talk about them and articulate them in a way that I can't yet. So thank you for that. Well, I mean, the way you articulate the idea of credential and how your calling will outdo the credentials, that's a story so many of us have learned and just need to hear. So thank you for articulating that in a way I hadn't thought about. My question, I had a few moments in my life, probably more than I wanted, where the calling leads you to a place you actually don't want to be. And even just, it sounds silly now to think about it this way, but like in the studies or in things, and I remember talking to someone, I think it was my dad at one point, where I said, Dad, I just don't think I can keep doing it. I don't know, like if I'm called to this kind of ministry or this sort of thing, like why am I spending years in this, in the PhD and all those things that just grind? And my dad had this response of, just remember that Moses spent 40 years in the desert.
Absolutely. Right.
And it was really helpful to hear that at some level, but it also didn't help. But it helped. But do you have moments that you can share of being in the desert, and how did you overcome them, or what was it that got you through?
100%. So in between the sort of the two banks, I decided to go work for the Federal Reserve because I wanted to get more credentials. So I was living in Youngstown. This office was in Cleveland, and I remember commuting because I was not at a point where I just had the financial means to sort of live my own. So I was still living at home and commuting to this job, and remember just at one point just being so frustrated because there were times when, it was by itself like on a good day, a 90-minute drive but then again, Northeast Ohio has winters like Connecticut. There were times where, it would be a 3 or 4 hour commute one way because of weather and things like that. And I found myself just frustrated and anguished and said, like, I believe that I was supposed to leave to go get this additional experience and perspective. And I've been there. As a matter of fact, I then started saying, okay, it's time for me to go back. And I started applying for jobs. And they would look at my credentials and say, wow, this is great. You've got all the things we want. And then invariably something would happen and that opportunity wouldn't present itself. And after 2 or 3 times, I'm like, wait a minute. I believe I was following my calling, that and it is important to get credentials, right? So I'm not saying, it's just a calling and not credentials. and I'm doing what I think is the right step to get the additional credentials to ultimately continue to follow why aren't these things falling in place? And, you know, and you have to find, you know, and it was ultimately somebody that said something or some word of encouragement that said, but during that time, it felt like 40 years. It was only a couple of years, and you start to question, and you start to get, right, we're human. You get frustrated. You're like, no, I'm second guessing myself now. So, you know, that was one. There were times, frankly, at the city, even after having been elected mayor, right, that you sort of say, well, I know that this was the path I was supposed to be on. And particularly if you get a couple of victories and things start to work well, you just assume, yeah, this is going to be. But that's not how life works, and it's not how, even when you're in the midst of your calling, it works. So, you know, I'm grateful. You know, my wife has helped, you know, keep the perspective when I was anguished or frustrated, or a close friend or something, and just that ultimately, right before you think that you're at wit's end, sort of hits that reset button or allows you to see that path of light. And I'm so grateful. And I'm sure I'm sitting here today. I'm thrilled and honored to be doing what I'm doing, but reminding myself when that next bend in the road comes, you know, you've been here before. So I get it. Sometimes you don't want to hear it, and it sounds like, oh boy. But to me, that's why, for me, I can only speak for myself. It is so important to have in those darkest times something to fall back on, to rely on, and that's my faith. It is no wonder, you know, as human beings, we've got to find that solace, that support somewhere. And for people who find it in their faith, fine. Other people find it in hobbies. But, you know, other people find it in destructive behavior, or they find themselves spiraling in drugs, and just any number of things. So it doesn't make me better. It doesn't make me above temptation, but I know when I hit those moments, I've got to turn to something. We all have to turn to something. It's about what you turn to, and hopefully it's something that doesn't end up destroying you from the inside out. And again, there's plenty of stories about people who take a faith journey that does that. But I think, to me, that's just always a sobering reminder.
So again, I love what you said.
Thank you.
I also have the philosophy in life, look for the good and you'll find the good. Mm-hmm. I tell that to my boys who are now young men, and sometimes they don't even want to hear it anymore. But another one is, if you change the way you look at things, the things that you look at will change. Yep. So it's all about what you said. So I live by that and by gratitude. Mm-hmm. My question is, when you came here in 2017, what did you see in Hartford that attracted you? What did you hope to change?
Right.
And where are you now on that journey? Are you where you want to be? And right. I'm going to guess that you're still moving forward. Yep. So what did you see? Right. Where are you, and what do you want to see in the future?
So what I immediately saw in Hartford were shades of Youngstown, but further progressed. A city that, you know, is full of diverse people, that has serious challenges, but also assets and a pathway and an opportunity. So immediately, and that's where my wife and I both immediately felt this connection, because again, we're from the Midwest. We spent Midwest, and then in DC, had actually ironically come to Hartford as a part of my portfolio in DC. But when we actually thought that this might be a place we'd relocate, we drove up, sort of felt, because initially we thought, oh, Connecticut, New England, like this is going to be, and when we came to Hartford, it's like, oh, this is like Youngstown. So there was that connection, because I could see the rough edges of the city and the things that were challenging the city, but also immediately saw that. So that was appealing. And then to be able to come to join an organization that at the time the board was like, yep, this organization's been around for 92 years, it's done great work, but it's time for this organization to reimagine, or to have a vision of its relevance and its impact. So I was like, wow, you're offering me an opportunity to join an organization that has resources and assets and relationships and partnerships to help chart a new vision for itself, and by extension, help chart a new vision for the region. So that was exceedingly appealing to me. And as much as I love my hometown, the assets that existed here in when I say Hartford, the city and the region, were far beyond. I tell people I would have killed to have the assets and the building blocks that Hartford has now, when I was mayor of Youngstown. So this journey over these almost 8 years has been, moments of frustration, but I will say, as we stand in our 100th year as a foundation and the relationships with our donors and our partners and our nonprofit stakeholders, I couldn't be more excited about what this year and the next few years have to offer. So I think we are exactly at the right place at the right time. And again, not because of any individual thing that I've done, because I do think things are divinely appointed and ordained, and the colleagues I work with and the partners that we have. And I say that knowing the chaos and the destruction that is happening, in this country, politically, culturally, and otherwise. So I'm not naive to that. But again, there's the view of what's happening now, very real pain being inflicted, the cruelty, but also that doesn't diminish the enthusiasm I have about the vision of the organization I'm a part of, this community and the path we're on, because this too shall pass. We will emerge from this the same way. None of us knew what was going to happen to COVID, but I was convinced that we would emerge from COVID as a more dynamic, impactful organization, and that's exactly what we've done. This community and we collectively will emerge. So yes, I'm excited about where we are. There's going to be bumps in the road. We have to deal with the very real things that are happening. But to me, that's where I'm not sure there's anything that could convince me that for the next 3, 4, 5 years to be anywhere other than right here. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. You got it. That's exactly it. That's it. Well, thank you. Thank you. With the right colleagues and the right partners in the community. And again, we remind ourselves daily, like, we're blessed to have the resources that we have, but nothing will be accomplished without the partnerships that we have with donors, with organizations such as, Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, with so many others who are represented here. And to me, my staff would absolutely kill me. There are going to be between next Thursday, April 10th, and the end of this year, there are things that we're going to be announcing and sharing that hopefully will just make abundantly clear and concrete that in the midst of all of this turmoil and chaos, that our commitment to this region, to our partners, is more robust and exhilarating than it's ever been. So a week from tomorrow through the end of this year, I promise you that there are going to be a series of things that we announce and share that we think are going to be catalytic and transformative for our relationships with this community for the next decade plus. Thank you.
I hope there's another question, but I have to say this. I love how leaders that most inspire us insist, it's not me, I'm not doing it, it's just this great. And the people that don't inspire us are the ones who constantly say, I'm so great, I'm doing all these things, I've got the best people, I'm the best. So thank you for that vision, it's inspiring.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you.
As a former student of this great university or seminary, whatever you choose, I had a question just thinking of your experience growing up in a city that had like economic decline. I come from Hamtramck, Michigan, which is the booming city of the Dodge brothers and whatnot.
Yep.
And, seeing like similar struggles and places like Youngstown and the potential that Youngstown has versus a city like Hamtramck or Flint and whatnot, I just had a really strong question where a city where people oftentimes face doubt and limitations, both internal and external, how do you personally overcome the feeling of not being believed in? So in other words, what advice do you have for those who struggle to push forward when their environment, which is not oftentimes like Hartford, or the seminary, it's like a bubble in its own, doesn't seem to support their ambitions?
That's a great question, and there is no easy answer, and I can only share how I've sought to navigate that. And again, it goes back to my faith. You have to understand that it's going to require, I believe in grit and tenacity and perseverance and hard work. Like, I'm all about that, but it has to also involve your willingness to submit to something else, something other than yourself, right? It could be another person, a group of people, your faith, because we're not equipped as human beings to, be, in solitude and without being in connection and in concert with someone else or something else. So in doing that, you have to find, there's going to be some person, group of people, or something that needs to inspire, that needs to keep you grounded, that doesn't allow you to get an individual to get caught in their own, doom loop, doom spiral. And to me, that's where communities like Youngstown, Hamtramck, and so many others can get caught in that, where individuals can get caught in that. So, that's why, to me, it has been so important, even in my frailties and in my imperfections, to be able to turn and find some reconciliation or validation in, and for me, it's been my faith and others who I have admired, even if they have a different belief system or even if they have a different pathway. So I say all that to say that what you described is very real, it's very difficult, but so often people are like, I'm just going to push my way through it. I'm just going to, put my head down and push through this in and of myself and by myself. And I've just never found in my experience for that to be, successful. Maybe people can point to one or two people who's like, yep, they just grin through sheer grit and determination and force of will. So, and I have also found the benefit of, there is typically always some similarly situated city, community, individual who has gone through this, who has a lesson to say, well, this is what we're, even if the same exact thing doesn't work for you, there is another side of this. There is an opportunity to emerge from that. That's the best I can offer, and it's one of those things that sometimes it goes against our personality or our comfort or what we, I don't feel comfortable. I want to figure this out on my own. It's just, the older I've gotten, the more I'm like, yep, okay, I get it. So, somebody's been through this, some community's been through this. There is some lesson out there. You have to be patient, but I promise you, there is more than one pathway, to find and get yourself or the community to that place where it's like, okay, now I can see that there's a path ahead here. So. Thank you all again. I as much as I enjoyed, being invited, it's the conversation and the questions and the interaction that I have truly benefited from. So thank you, Joel. Thank you, Susan. Thank you all for the opportunity.
I want to add one thing here, and it's tied to what I said earlier, that often the people you see out there, in the same way that I commented on your I think you said something like, well, it's there's preordained, or this isn't me. It's just, and we all see you as doing all those things. And I was also just struck in something that you said about, on the outside, I think many people would look at people like you and maybe someone like me and just think they're gritting and bearing it. They're persisting, they're going, and don't realize that actually what's happening every week or almost every week is we are getting to that point where if I don't get myself into church and have me understand my faith and who I am in God, and that I am not this job, I am a child of God, I won't make it through this week. And what people see as grit and determination is actually just me coming down and breaking down and saying, I need help because I can't do it. And so I just see that in you, and I'm grateful for that. And it's been the story of my life as well. So I'm just grateful to hear it expressed in you. Can we thank Jay one more time? Thank you. On behalf of Hartford International, I do want to thank the family of Michael and Nancy Ryan, who aren't here tonight, for this lectureship, for those who supported it, those who endowed it to make it possible. Jay knows a lot about endowments that help bring about a great future. Please continue to support us in your future. This is the sort of thing we do. We love that we have students here tonight, that you're tuning in from afar. We have food and drink here. Let's have a little bit of a continued conversation. Jay will be here for a few minutes at least to say hello to you all and have some food and drink. So thanks again and good night.